3, 2, 1.
Welcome into the MASN newsroom on this Tuesday afternoon, day 2 of what should have been the winter meetings from the Omni Dallas Hotel in Dallas, Texas. Instead, we are here to discuss all the topics happening around baseball, in particular what's going on with the Baltimore Orioles. We've got a great show for you today. We're going to have VP and Assistant GM Sig Mejdal on the show in just a bit. We're also going to have MASNsports.com's Steve Molesky joining the show, and then we're going to close out with Alex Fast of Pitcher List. And through this all, we are taking your comments, questions as we go along, as we're live on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So thank you so much for tuning in, and be sure to comment with your thoughts throughout the show. And joining me today, as joining me all week, is Brendan Mortensen, my co-host. And Brendan, let's talk about Sig Mejdal, because we're about to play an interview with him. Always a fascinating conversation with the guy who is the head of the analytics department in Baltimore, and he has really reworked the entire Orioles analytics side and brought a new perspective to the Orioles front office.
Yeah, as we're in the midst of winter meetings here, Mike Elias and Sig Mejdal going after some of those analytical darlings, right? Look at Jose Iglesias before the 2020 season. The previous 4 seasons, Iglesias was 3rd among shortstops in defensive value added. And funny enough, he was brought on to the Orioles primarily because of that defensive value. We know how that turned out with the bat.
Absolutely. And Sig Mejdal brought his interesting perspective notes. I asked him about the use of technology in the Orioles organization, how the shutdown affected things, how the shortened season affected things. It was an interesting conversation. Here's my conversation earlier with Sig Mejdal, Orioles assistant GM. Now we're joined on MASN All Access by Sig Mejdal, who is the assistant general manager and vice president of the Baltimore Orioles. Sig, thanks so much for hopping on here.
Happy to be here, Paul.
And of course, your specialty is analytics. I love these conversations that we're able to have every year at winter meetings around this time. Couldn't do this in person, but still happy to have your insight. So let's go all the way back in time to the beginning of the baseball shutdown back in March. Of course, in the middle of spring training, players are sent home and they have to get a lot of work done and stay in shape at home, not knowing when baseball was going to return. How much was the analytics team able to help those players stay in shape and continue to develop even while they were at home?
Yeah. So I think the short answer is quite a bit. But it's not really the analysts helping the players. It's the analysts helping the coaches. And then it's the coaches who obviously are the ones helping the players. So we have a modern group of coaches who it's the opposite of being threatened by this stuff. They can't wait to see what the technology or data could reveal, and they can't wait to put it into action with the players.
So a player working out at home, if he's sending you video or sending you information, were you able to analyze that data and send it to the coaches to let them know things that they could work on?
So the ideal world, it's the coaches interacting with the players, and we're not middlemen or anything. So like I said, these coaches are sophisticated bunches. So we'll have body, bat trackers. And so to some degree, they were getting sent to player. The coaches were using that as they see fit, along with more traditional instruction and video being sent back and forth. So our coaches really thrived in this environment.
Interesting. So in terms of the season, once the regular season started to get going, obviously no fans in the ballpark and limited access really to all kinds of team personnel in the ballpark. But did that limit your ability to collect data during the regular season and during summer camp?
Well, I mean, beyond the fact that there were less games, no minor league games in the parks, and so we're not collecting data from that. There's nothing we could do about that. But for the players that we did have at the alternate training site, we had a full allocation of coaches and a full allocation of whatever tech we have in our system. And so we were running at 110% there.
That's great. And speaking of the fewer games available, obviously 60 games is not ideal for a sample size in any baseball format. Does that increase or decrease rather the amount of emphasis that the analytics side place on the kind of statistics and kind of information that comes back in such a small sample size?
Yeah, for so much of our decision aids, our models, which combine the expertise, the knowledge we know, along with updating their skill based on their performance or some other data from different tech. So yeah, the more samples, the better. So unfortunately, we didn't get as many samples as we'd like, but what we did get is still useful. So to answer your question, yeah, it probably had a slightly smaller voice in the decision making, but it was still there as appropriate as it should be.
Gotcha. And in terms of the alternate site at Bowie, how much were you able to get the technology that you needed in place to be able to track information and gather information at the alternate site with some of the team's top prospects?
Yeah, well, without a collection of minor league teams and our coaches scattered, with the focus at one site, we were able to get everything that we had in our power there, along with the coaches we had. So it was wonderful what was going on there.
Gotcha. Would you say that you were one of the teams that had more technology in place at the alternate site, or were you able to kind of determine how much technology and how much data gathering there that was going on at other teams' alternate sites?
Yeah, the idea of data or tech or analytics in baseball is nothing new. So there's 400 analysts in baseball, and this idea of taking advantage of what you can at your alternate training site was not lost on any team. So I think I can't speak for the other teams, but I think we were as strong as any team as far as the information we were gathering on a daily basis there.
Gotcha. And so when you went out and made some trades for some prospects that had appeared at a team's alternate site, for example, Kevin Smith at the Mets alternate site, was that something that you felt confident making a move like that? And were you able to see and gather any kind of analytics for a player that was at another team's alternate site based on the information that they had gathered?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we shared data. So there was a sharing network. So we would get the data, but unlike a completely competitive game, we don't have the confidence. We don't have the knowledge really of the effort the players and most importantly the pitchers were working on that day. When they're facing their own players, the innings may roll over. It's not a real competitive game. So with that in mind, yeah, we were careful to not overreact to, velocity being a couple miles lower, their curveball not having as much spin or whatever, that it may simply have been they are working on something and not pitching at 100.0%. So we had to take that into consideration, and we, of course, were careful with all that.
Is that something that you can follow up with a team representative about and maybe ask questions about how a pitcher or how a player is working that specific day or anything that they're working on in particular? Or is there kind of a go-between to try to help you facilitate and gather information for players at other alternate sites?
You can, but you have to consider the quality of the information you're getting back and the motivations of those providing that. So we're careful. And the last thing we wanted to do is pick up, a player that isn't all we think, because the team trading him away was telling us he's all we think.
Absolutely, makes sense. In terms of your own alternate site, you talked about all the information technology gathering that was going on at the alternate site. And so far from the media side, we've heard great things from the players about the development that they've been able to have at the alternate site and at the Fall Instructional League in October down in Florida. Particularly Zach Lowther, a guy that is one of the top prospects in the system, said it was one of the best years in terms of development he's had in a long time. Did you get any of the feedback from players that was similar to that, and what was that feedback?
No, that's great to hear. I hadn't heard that from Zach. I have heard it through some other sources, anecdotes of other players saying that, and that is just wonderful to hear, that because it was a unusual change. Instead of riding the bus, traveling, playing the baseball game, trying to find something decent to eat, and doing it all again, we had them at the same park every day with a great collection of coaches simply practicing and working on the process of getting better. And yeah, they were playing games, but it was less games and more practice. So that's wonderful to hear that Zach describes what we had hoped, and that was an improvement in all their skills.
Yeah, development is the name of the game. And in terms of other technologies, you've talked at times about being on the lookout for technologies that are on the rise that might be able to help baseball in a year or two down the line, but aren't quite ready to hit the main stage. One I think that is interesting in terms of the way that it has made its way through baseball so far, virtual reality. Is that something that you think has a future in baseball? And is that something, if you can tell us, that the Orioles have been able to use at all so far?
Yeah, so we know of at least two companies that are in that space, and we've had demos from both. We've priced both out. We're both in contact, or we're in contact with both, and it may be something we use in the near future. Sometimes I think you need to walk before you run, and so there's a lot visually you could still provide the players that we're creating the processes to that now. And if we see that they're demanding more, that they're demanding the virtual reality, well, it'd be foolish not to provide them with that.
Is that something that you've talked at times also about how players have been so receptive, and younger players tend to be very receptive to new information technology? Is that something that you see players being receptive to in the coming months and maybe coming years?
Yeah, it keeps surprising me, like how quickly the interest from the players for these previously pushed back on technologies or data or processes or ideas, how rapidly that changes. And I think, I mentioned that there's 400 analysts in baseball. These players have their college teammates that are in other organizations, and they're hearing success stories. There's enough written about, these success stories in the major leagues that you can't be a player today and expect to be all you could be without taking advantage of all the resources available. And that includes the technology that's out there now.
Right. And in terms of a new technology such as virtual reality, if it were to come into the Orioles organization, as how you mentioned, is that something that you would try out at a lower level in terms of a minor league level or an instructional league, or is that something that you would try out at the big league level and maybe use that technology and have it trickle down through the organization?
I think throughout. I mean, I think if I call them users, but if the player wants it, whether he's in the minor leagues or in the major leagues, it's in our best interest to provide it to him. So we're always careful that what we introduce is not going to do more harm than good, but it's really hard to imagine the harm in putting in more energies to try to pick up the delivery, the subtleties of the delivery, the movement of the pitcher you're going to face tonight. So when that technology becomes mature enough and there's interest, we'll be all over it.
Well, aside from virtual reality, are there any technologies that you're looking at that you can share with us right now that you think have a future in baseball? Maybe not in the next year, but maybe a few years down the line?
Yeah, the advancement of the bat and body sensors and trackers is amazing. They're getting smaller, they're getting more accurate, they're getting cheaper. The understanding of these things are really increasing. The world of force plates is making its way throughout baseball, so you could really see the ground forces the pitchers or hitters are generating. Computer vision advancements is probably the fastest area in advancement in all of computer science. And so there's all sorts of wonderful player tracking, ball tracking, even biomechanics that you could start to squeeze out from just a regular old video. And then there's the things that aren't nearly as sexy. I think an appreciation of sleep and nutrition and recovery that may not get the headlines because virtual reality is not related, but is an area that hasn't really been optimized, and a lot more attention is being put in those areas too.
Fascinating. Well, you mentioned, is it force plates? What is that technology? Is that something you could explain?
Yeah, so it's been used in the golf world for, I don't know, at least half a decade, maybe a decade. So you can imagine you're taking your swing, and there's literally a force plate that you're swinging on, and so any twisting, torque, X, Y force, it's measuring. So, right, the ground force is such an important initiation for any rotation, whether it's a rotational aspects of hitting or the rotational aspects of pitching. And so it really reveals something to the coaches and to the players that previously they would sort of have to intuit from either the results or some body motion that happened real quickly. And when you see how they're used in the golf world, it's impossible not to see parallels and be optimistic of how it could be used in the baseball world.
That is incredible. Do you see more parallels between the golf and baseball world in terms of the technology? I guess your swinging and the use of force could be similar in that kind of in those two sports there.
Yeah, they're both rotational sports. I think golf is, for a variety of reasons, is been on the forefront of a lot of these things compared to baseball. So many of the technologies, whether it's a TrackMan, the radar devices, or these body or bat club sensors, they were developed in the golf world, and they're now making their way into the baseball world. So taking a peek at what they're doing in the golf world sometimes could reveal a glimpse of the future of the baseball world.
See, this is good to know, because I could definitely use a couple strokes off my golf game, and maybe this technology might be able to help there as well. So we really appreciate the time and appreciate your insight as always. Fascinating conversation and information coming from Sig Mejdal, Vice President and, of course, Assistant General Manager with the Baltimore Orioles. Sig, thanks again for hopping on.
My pleasure, Paul. We'll see ya.
Well, we're already starting to see the rewards of the process within the Orioles organization and even at the major league level. You look at the pitching stats, the Orioles pitching staff in 2019 had the worst ERA in baseball, 30th. They had 1,248 strikeouts. That was third to last in all of baseball, and they gave up over 300 home runs, which was the most in Major League Baseball. A year later, now granted smaller sample size, but the ERA went down by more than a run per 9. The strikeouts were 25th in baseball, so a moderate improvement there, and they allowed just 79 home runs, which was the 14th fewest in Major League Baseball. So you're already beginning to see some changes within the Orioles organization and some positives from this front office's changes. And Brendan, when you look at the numbers just from Mike Elias's first year to his second, you can make a good case that analytics have greatly improved this organization and made an impact at the big league level.
Yeah, and one guy in particular who I think had a lot of help from the Orioles analytical department was Keegan Aiken, one of the additions to the 2020 rotation. In the minors, Keegan Aiken relied on his fastball a lot. It was his strikeout pitch, it was his go-to, and you might think he's pumping that thing 98, 99 miles an hour. No, his fastball sits around 91, 92. It's not an overpowering pitch in the traditional sense, but his spin rate is so good that according to StatCast, that pitch looks like it's coming in around 96, 97 miles an hour, and that spin rate is similar to Shane Bieber, who of course won the AL Cy Young. So that's really an analytical darling there in Keegan Aiken.
Yeah, and you mentioned an analytical darling in Jose Iglesias off the top of the show. Now that Jose Iglesias has left the organization via trade, they have a hole to fill at shortstop. And earlier I spoke to Steve Melewski of MASNsports.com of who they could sign in free agency to fill that hole at shortstop. Here's our conversation. The great Steve Melewski of MASN. The great Steve Molesky of MASNsports.com is our next guest here on MASN All Access. Steve, thanks so much for hopping on.
Paul, thanks for the great hype.
Yeah, I built you up a whole lot, and I know that you were going to deliver. Well,
pressure's on, buddy. Yeah. Now I'm nervous.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about the minor leagues, some of the stuff that you've been writing for MASNsports.com. But let's start first and foremost with free agency, because the Orioles shook up their infield with a couple moves. Hanser Alberto getting non-tendered, Jose Iglesias getting traded. Couple massive holes in that infield now. Shortstop appears to be the biggest one there. Some big name free agents out there in terms of the shortstop market. Marcus Semien, Andrelton Simmons, Didi Gregorius. Probably going to all be out of the Orioles' price range, but is there somebody that you think, or a name or two that you think might fit what the O's are looking for as a potential shortstop free agent?
That is a great question, and I'm not sure what direction they're going to go in. I mean, you're right. The free agent class seems to have a lot of names that are probably not names the Orioles will be involved with. You know, Freddie Galvis is a name that some people have mentioned, who's a decent defender over the years, and we've seen him play in this division, and, you know, might be someone they look at. I believe there were one or two non-tendered players that maybe the Orioles would look at. Rodriguez, I believe, from previously with Tampa Bay, is a guy who's played some shortstop for them, who's out there. So we're going to see what they come up with. I mean, it's going to be tough to duplicate Jose Iglesias, obviously. I mean, I think the Orioles really liked Stallings, the pitcher they got, and then they took a long shot flyer on the younger player. But replacing that's a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have some depth at the minor league spot in terms of shortstops and middle infielders, but it seems like those guys are a ways away when you look at guys like Gunnar Henderson or Jordan Westberg or Terran Vavra, who was recently acquired. Do you feel like maybe not in 2021, but maybe in 2022 or 3 or down the line, the Orioles might have some prospects already within their system that might be long-term answers in the middle of the infield?
That's what their hope is. And if you look at the first two Mike Elias drafts, he's drafted 5 shortstops, like within the first 5 rounds of the 2 drafts combined. Jordan Westberg, of course, Gunnar Henderson. And so Adam Hall is a guy who's played short, who was drafted before Elias got here. Mason McCoy is an older guy, was not added to the 40-man roster, is Rule 5 eligible, who has played some middle infield and was in spring training. But the Orioles don't seem to have that guy right on the cusp. There's not a Mountcastle of shortstops, you know, a guy who we know is really close. So that's a year or 2 away. But I recently wrote an article, Paul, on MASNsports.com. You know, MLB Pipeline has 5 shortstops in their Oriole top 30. That's a good group. And there are 5 others they've acquired, some of which were previously ranked that are no longer ranked. So they've got 8 or 10 guys at the shortstop position. You know, you look at the minor leagues, you wonder where they're going to play them all. Some will probably play second base. They'll get at bats for them. But there's depth at the position in the Oriole farm. There just aren't any top-level guys ready for the major leagues right now. It doesn't appear.
That's a spectacular number, though. 5 in the top 30 in terms of shortstop prospects, and those guys will certainly be working their way up through the Orioles system at some point over the next couple years. Let's talk about the minor league system, because it has been a hot topic this offseason as we wait to find out how many affiliates teams are going to have, where those affiliates are going to be located. From what you're hearing and people that you're talking to, do you think that we're going to get an answer at some point soon as to what the minor leagues will look like in 2021?
I think there's a great chance that we're getting close to that this week there might be some clarity on that. And as it relates to the Orioles, there's been the continued speculation that Aberdeen will become a full season team, bumping somebody out. And so that's the hard part for the Orioles. And for those of us who've been covering that system for a long time and have a lot of friends wondering what team might be the odd man out here. And, you know, that's still an open question. Frederick was mentioned when they published that initial list, which seems like years ago now. But that doesn't mean that's who it will be. I do hope if one affiliate has to go, that another major league organization, perhaps the Nationals or someone, can scoop up that team. And there are some people who think that would be a good fit. So I think this week, within a day or two, we might have some clarity.
Yeah, hoping to get some answers at some point soon there. In terms of things that could be happening soon, we know the Rule 5 draft is around the corner on Thursday, and the Orioles have the 5th pick. They have a couple open roster spots if they want to take somebody or two in the Rule 5 draft, and they have a long history, obviously, of taking players in that Rule 5 draft. On tomorrow's show, we're going to have your interview with J.J. Cooper, who is the expert in the Rule 5 draft. But could you give us a little teaser and preview of that interview, some things that you might have learned from J.J. Cooper about this draft class coming up on Thursday?
Well, he thinks it's a good Rule 5 draft class for infielders, which is exactly what the Orioles could be in the market for. He says, and I think this makes common sense, that you don't usually get a starting shortstop in the Rule 5 draft. So I think if fans are thinking that's where the Orioles will look to replace Iglesias, that would surprise me. That doesn't mean they can't get a shortstop they like and want to take a look at in the Rule 5. And he mentioned Kyle Holder, who was a Yankee first-round draft pick in 2015 out of the University of San Diego, who's a plus glove guy who was one time ranked in the top 30 for Baseball America for the Yankees, not currently, who's a shortstop and a plus defender. His bat has not been great, although at Double-A Trenton in 2019, he did have 742 OPS, so it was up from some previous years. And there's Andy Ibanez is the name you mentioned from the Texas Rangers, 27 years old, played at Triple-A in 2019. His bat is ahead of his glove. He's a Cuban player, played in the WBC for Cuba. In fact, was the youngest player on their 2013 team. He's been around a while, 27, and Holder is 26. So older guys with experience who are on the cusp of the majors, that might fit for the Orioles right now to bring to camp and take a look at, not to say this is our shortstop, a Rule 5 pick. And there are other names in there. Newton, a young kid with the Mets, is 21 and who hasn't hit much and hasn't played above low A. So that, to me, doesn't add up for the Orioles, but he is their number 14 prospect. And, Paul, if you look at top 30 lists, infielders who were unprotected, there are a whole lot of them. You can get if you want a top 30 prospect in the Rule 5 in the infield, you can get one. And that doesn't mean he'll be the answer to your prayers, but that means you'll get someone who has some pedigree and a decent resume that analysts do like.
And with the number 1 pick in the Rule 5 draft in his first year as GM, we knew Mike Elias took Richie Martin, a shortstop, with the Oakland A's organization at that point, who had only played at the Double-A level, and he could factor into the equation at shortstop for next year for the Baltimore Orioles if he stays at the major league level. So all things to consider there. Steve, we really appreciate the insight and look forward to reading more on MASNsports.com and look forward to seeing your interview with J.J. Cooper tomorrow on our show. But in the meantime, thanks so much for joining us.
All right, Paul, you got it. Anytime.
Let's dive right back into that shortstop conversation because, Brendan, I know you have been on the Andrelton Simmons train from the beginning, and he certainly profiles as a Jose Iglesias plus, a better defender and probably better offensively throughout the course of his career. But let's say that Andrelton Simmons is a little bit out of the Orioles' price range. Who else could you see them going after, aside from some of the names that Steve just mentioned?
Yeah, my personal preference aside, I don't think the Orioles go for Andrelton Simmons. Danny Echeverria is a name that jumps out to me as somebody that the Orioles could be interested in. Rock Kabako had reported before the 2019 offseason that the Orioles were rumored to be interested in Echeverria. He's a veteran guy. He's been all around Major League Baseball. He can play any position in the infield, but I think the O's would probably stick him at shortstop. He's got a decent bat, hit around 250 in his last stint with the Braves, so I think it would be a solid pickup for the O's.
Absolutely, and we talked yesterday about Yolmer Sanchez, where he could fit into the Orioles infield, and maybe an underrated pickup, a waiver claim from a couple months ago. He probably profiles more as a third baseman or second baseman as opposed to a shortstop, but that might make Mike Elias' job a little bit easier as he looks for a clear-cut shortstop in this free agency period. Well, where the Orioles might go for shortstop, maybe they might go for a starting pitcher to fill out their starting rotation. I caught up with Alex Fast, who is analytically minded at Pitcher List, another guy who delves deep into the statistics. he talked a little bit about some starting pitching options the O's could evaluate this free agency period. Joined now on MASN All Access by Alex Fast, who is VP at Pitcher List, associate producer at Major League Baseball as well. Alex, thanks so much for hopping on.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. Excited to talk about some pitching today.
We've had you on the MASN All Access podcast before. You've been on O's Extra numerous times because your insight into the deeper dives on analytics and how that affects and what we can learn from it in terms of Major League Baseball and some of their premier players and how it relates to the Orioles in particular. Love getting your insight here. Let's dive right into the free agent market and talk about some of the top-end starting pitchers that are out there, because this might be a slightly underrated free agent class when it comes to pitchers. You have some great names with Trevor Bauer, James Paxton, Masahiro Tanaka. What are some of the factors and some of the qualities of these top-end starting pitchers that make them so attractive to teams?
Yeah, definitely. So we can start with Trevor Bauer, who's probably unarguably the biggest free agent, at least starting pitching free agent on the market right now. And he made some fantastic strides last year, and which is good for him because a lot of people were thinking that the 2017 that he put up might have been a fluke because there was a little bit of regression. Maybe it was actually the 2018. There was some regression in 2019 and now 2020, of course. And we saw jumps from him virtually across the board, most notably in his fastball spin rate, right? Now, by increasing that fastball spin rate, he's allowed to have, or gives him more success at the top of the zone with that four-seamer. It sets up his breaking pitches super well, and we saw him make guys look silly. Now, those changes I don't necessarily think are automatically going to go by the wayside wherever he signs, right? Spin rate isn't something that he's necessarily just going to immediately lose. I think it's something that's going to stick for him wherever he goes next year. For a guy like Masahiro Tanaka, there was a big change that happened for him in 2019. He used to be a really splitter-heavy pitcher, right? That splitter was a fantastic pitch for him. And then he said, with the introduction of a new ball, he wasn't able to quite get the same grip for the pitch. He wasn't able to feel that splitter, which is sometimes the problem with a splitter. It's a really big feel pitch, maybe more so than any major pitch in baseball right now. 2020 came around. There's a lot of worry. Is he going to lose that splitter again? Is he going to get it back? He didn't even worry about it. He went to that slider, right? He increased the usage and it returned fantastic numbers for him. So I think wherever he lands, I think maybe it'll be back with the Yankees. He's going to focus on that slider one more time. He's also a guy where we're like, okay, is he finally going to get injured? We've been kind of waiting for that elbow to fall off for the past 4 or 5 years, and he's kind of been the picture of health. So I'm excited to see what he can do in 2021 with that slider. When it comes to health, we also have to talk about James Paxton, another guy that you brought up. There's a lot of risk when it comes to a team signing him because can he stay healthy? Can the Big Maple stay healthy? I think if he can, we're still looking at ace upside from James Paxton. I don't necessarily think that the Orioles are going to be focused on any of these three guys as much as I would love to see any of them in a Baltimore uniform, but there are some other names down the list that they could sign that could be really impactful for them in 2021.
Yeah, before we get into those real quickly, Trevor Bauer has been very vocal, to say the least, about analytics in baseball and the kind of work that he has done off the field in the offseason to try to improve his game. And he always talks about he's not all that athletic, he's not the strongest or fastest guy, but he's been able to use analytics. What kind of impact do you think Trevor Bauer has had on the analytics community, and what the perception is of analytics in baseball, in particular when it comes to pitchers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I know that there's a lot of opinions out there about Trevor Bauer, and there are some people in the media who feel a certain way about him and some writers who feel a certain way about him. So if we just focus on the analytics, right, it seems like he brings a big awareness to that community, which I think is really big. There's a really great book by, I believe, Travis Sawchik, and I can't remember the other author off the top of my head, named The MVP Machine, that talks a lot about Trevor Bauer and talks about conduits, right? People who can take high-end analytical concepts and bring them in to an organization and bring them to pitchers or hitters specifically, guys who might be a little bit wary, right? When we talk about these high-end analytical concepts, they're high-end, right? They can be alienating. And what makes Trevor Bauer so appealing, I think, to some of these teams is he can take these concepts and make them relatable and let other pitchers know, hey, this isn't some Harvard grad talking about it. This is me. This is a guy who won a Cy Young. This is a pitcher. This is why it's important. This is why you need to focus focus on your spin rate. This is why you need to focus on what Driveline calls hacking the kinetic chain. Because really, at the end of the day, what that community wants to do, in my opinion, is make each individual pitcher better at what they do. Right? It makes them want to shine in their own way. It doesn't want to make them cookie cutter. It doesn't want to make them fall into an organizational mentality. It makes them want to excel at what they excel at. Focus on their specific limitations for their specific body and make them turn them to their advantage, right? So what I think Bauer can do wherever he goes is say, hey, these are the things that you guys need to do in the organization as a pitcher to make yourself better.
It's very well said and fascinating to see how his story has had an impact in the analytics community and the perception, at least, of the analytics community. But let's talk about, because you just mentioned some starting pitching free agents that are out there that might fit more into what the Orioles are looking for. They still have several top prospects in their system that are waiting to make their debuts, so they probably don't want to block too many of those guys with somebody on a long-term deal. But they're always looking to add pitching depth like they did last offseason with a Cole Stewart, somebody to a low major league deal or a minor league deal. Are there any names out there that you think we should be paying attention to that might fit what the O's are looking for?
Yeah, I really kind of rack my brain to think about this, right? I one of my favorite things to do is to try and get a sense. I know nothing about what the Orioles are doing organizationally, right? I'm not an insider or anything like that. All I can do is look at data and make a best guess. And it seems like in the past 2 years, they had the third highest changeup usage of any team in baseball. It seems like they like those changeup guys, and that was kind of proven by Tommy Malone last year, who they brought in on a one-year deal. Fantastic changeup. Then they moved him to Atlanta. Obviously, he got injured and wasn't able to finish the way he wanted to finish. So I was looking at who has a really good changeup among the free agent class, right? And the one name that kind of popped out to me that I thought was really interesting is Trevor Cahill. His changeup rate shot up to 30%, which is a career high for him last year, and the pitch returned to 250 batting average against, expected batting average against a 199, which is really good, a 275 WOBA on the changeup, which was better than league average, which is about 288. That's not even the best pitch in his arsenal. That's his curveball, 96th percentile in spin rate, although the active spin, how much spin contributes to movement, a little around league average, so not great. Although he started locating that curveball a bit better at the bottom of the zone last year, had a lot of success for San Francisco coming into the end of the year. He's someone who I think could be maybe a legitimate 3 or 4 for them. Take it easy on Dean Kramer. Take it easy on Keegan Aiken. Take it easy on Bruce Zimmerman. Guys that they might want to give a little bit of rest as the year progresses. I think really quick as a tangent, that's going to be really important for an organization like the Orioles, right? None of these guys had full innings limits last year, right? No one's going to be able to throw 200 innings this year because no one threw over 85 or 90 in the last year. It's going to be really important for some of those back end guys like Jorge Lopez, maybe Michael Baumann, Zach Lothar, to get a bit of those innings. 2 other quick names that come to mind, though. Tyler Chatwood, not the best year in terms of ERA, obviously at 5.30 ERA, but his first 2 starts where he showed an increase in cutter usage was really, really fantastic for him. A lot of promise there. Was able to eat some innings for the Cubs as a long relief guy. And then someone maybe who could be interesting, Colin McHugh. Didn't have a lot of time with Boston, but remember, he spent a lot of time with Houston when Mike Elias was there. So probably a pretty intimate knowledge of Colin McHugh, was dealing with the elbow injury last year. But I'd be curious to see if they take a run at him because he probably wouldn't cost a lot of money, and there's a lot of high upside for McHugh.
Yeah, we've seen Mike Elias go to that well, the Houston well of information and players and members of the front office that he knows well from his days there, and he certainly has picked a lot of crafty lefties and some bounce back candidates. So those guys fit all of those, one or more of those categories at least. So it'll be interesting to see if they do delve into the free agent market, who they end up with. But Alex Fast, VP at Pitcher List, thanks so much for being our conduit and sharing your information with us and explaining things in a way that we all can understand and appreciate.
I appreciate it, and that's why you're the best at what you do. That was some improv skill 101, and I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me. Happy to talk anytime.
One name that Alex just mentioned, Colin McHugh, is a potential free agent target for the Orioles this winter. Brendan, why does that name stick out to you, and why would it make sense for the Orioles to pursue him?
Yeah, Paul, the reason I think McHugh is interesting is because he doesn't necessarily need to be a starter. When you're looking at the Orioles, there are a ton of pitching prospects who could be called up in the 2021 season. In 2019, McHugh pitched in 35 games. 8 of them were starts. So realistically, I think McHugh could come in, be a number 5 starter for the first half of the season. And then once you want to call up some of those prospects to the big league level, you could push McHugh to the bullpen where he is still very effective. He had an ERA of under 2 back in 2018. So I think he could be a guy who could be a good starter at the beginning of the year for the Orioles and then shift back into the bullpen.
And it certainly makes sense that they would sign somebody to a 1 or 2 maximum year deal, just considering the fact that they have those pitchers that you mentioned. And it seems like less of a need now than it did at this point last year. Brendan, always appreciate your insight, and thank you so much to everybody watching. This just about wraps up our show for day 2 of what should have been the winter meetings. Thanks, of course, to Bobby Blanco running the show behind the scenes, Hannah Broder and Amy Jennings for their work behind the scenes as well. We will be back tomorrow for our final show of the week. We'll have a podcast, of course, on Thursday, which you can catch on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. Watch it on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter. Anywhere you get your podcasts, you can get the MASN All Access podcast. Our show tomorrow starts at 3 o'clock, so tune in for that and comment along. I'm Paul Mancano. We'll see you then.